¿Quieres hablar inglés como un nativo? Prueba el método shadowing. Repite conmigo en voz alta y sin miedo. Escucha, imita y habla. Así es como se entrena el oído y la boca. Aquí no solo aprendes, aquí hablas inglés desde el primer minuto. Suscríbete y empieza ahora mismo a hablar como siempre soñaste. I got into the taxi without saying much, just a quiet good afternoon, as I closed the door behind me. It was one of those gray days, the kind where the clouds don't threaten to rain but still block out the sun. I wasn't in a rush, and the city felt slower than usual. The driver, a man in his late 40s with tired eyes and calloused hands, adjusted the mirror to glance at me briefly. We didn't exchange pleasantries beyond what was necessary. As the car moved through the streets, weaving between traffic and silence, he suddenly said, "Do you mind if I talk a little?" I nodded without hesitation, not knowing what was about to unfold in the next 30 minutes. What began as a routine ride turned into something deeply human. He didn't ask for advice. He didn't expect judgment. He just needed a witness to his story. He started by mentioning his son, a boy of 13 who had been in and out of the hospital for over a year. He said the boy had always been full of life, the kind that laughs loud, runs fast, and makes silly faces just to see others smile. But lately he was barely strong enough to hold a spoon. The diagnosis had come like a storm, swift, unexpected, merciless. "Leukemia," the driver said with a sigh so heavy I felt it in my own chest. He told me about sleepless nights, about watching cartoons with his son just to make him forget the pain. He spoke about the feeling of helplessness, of sitting in a hospital corridor, hoping for news, dreading the silence. His voice cracked once or twice, but he didn't stop. He kept his eyes on the road, hands steady, words flowing as if they had been waiting too long to be said. Then, almost as if he needed to balance the pain with memory, he began to speak of better times. He told me about how he used to play guitar in a small local band. "Nothing big," he said with a soft smile, "but we used to play in parks, at school events, sometimes even weddings." His eyes lit up as he described those moments. The thrill of applause, the way music made him feel invincible. "I thought I'd be a musician," he said, chuckling faintly. But life had other plans. He spoke of dreams rerouted by responsibility, of opportunities passed by because of bills, family, illness. He never once sounded bitter. It was more like someone who had made peace with what life had taken and learned to be grateful for what remained. "I don't regret much," he said, "except maybe not recording at least one album." The city moved around us as he continued. Horns honked, people crossed streets, and yet inside that car, time felt still. He spoke of his wife, the strongest woman I know, and how she had held their family together when he felt like falling apart. "She's quiet," he said, "but fierce. She reads to our son every night, even when he's too tired to stay awake. Sometimes I think he pretends to sleep just to hear her voice." His admiration for her was evident, woven into every word. He talked about their arguments, too, Not to complain, but to show the reality of love tested by hardship. "We fight sometimes," he admitted. "Mostly about money, sometimes about fear. But we always find a way back to each other." He didn't paint a perfect picture. He painted a real one, honest and raw. At one point, he grew quiet, as if searching for the next thought among the noise of the city. Then he said, "You know, I don't talk about this often. Most passengers are in a hurry or on their phones. They don't look up, don't really want to hear." There was no bitterness in his voice, just observation. "But today, I needed to speak, and you listened." I hadn't said a single word. I hadn't interrupted. I just let him speak, let his story unfold without questions or comments. And maybe that's why he shared so much. Sometimes the deepest act of compassion isn't found in advice or solutions. It's in silence. It's in the space we offer someone to be heard. When we arrived at my destination, he looked at me and said, "Thank you for real. Thanks for listening." I nodded and smiled gently. "Anytime," I replied. As I stepped out, I carried his story with me, not as a burden, but as a gift. The taxi pulled away as I stood on the sidewalk, watching its taillights disappear into the afternoon traffic. I felt different, lighter in some ways, heavier in others. It's strange how a stranger's story can find a place inside you, as if you were meant to hold it for a while. I had only planned to get from one point to another to pass the time quietly in the back seat of a cab, but life had handed me something more. That man, his story, his son's fight, his lost dreams, it all lingered with me like an echo. I didn't know his name, and he didn't know mine. And yet, in that half hour, something profoundly human had taken place. We had connected without effort, without expectation. And I started to realize how rare and beautiful that is in a world that moves too fast. That night, I found myself replaying the conversation in my mind. His voice, the cadence of his words, the emotion behind them. It was all still vivid. I thought of his son lying in a hospital bed, of the stories they must tell each other to stay brave. I thought of his wife, her quiet strength anchoring the household. And I thought of him, a man behind the wheel, carrying pain and hope in equal measure. So many people move through the world holding things they never speak of, and when they finally do, it's often to someone they may never meet again. I wondered how many stories I had passed by without noticing. How many people needed just one moment of being heard. We are all, in some way, looking for someone to understand. Even briefly, even in silence. I also began to reflect on how little effort it takes to truly listen. Not to respond, not to fix, just to listen. There's something sacred in it, something healing. In a time when everyone wants to speak, to be seen, to be validated, the act of simply holding space for another can be transformative. That driver didn't need answers. He didn't want pity. He just wanted someone to witness his reality. And in giving him that, I realized I had received something too. A glimpse into the quiet courage of everyday life. It reminded me that love takes many forms, and one of them is the willingness to be present, even for a stranger. Listening is an act of love, and love, in its purest form, asks for nothing in return. The next morning, I woke up with a different sense of awareness. On my way to work, I looked at people more attentively. The barista with tired eyes, the woman on the train wiping away a tear discreetly, the old man feeding birds in the park. I started to wonder what stories lived behind those expressions, what burdens they carried quietly. I didn't ask, but I paid attention, and in doing so I felt more connected to the world around me. The taxi ride had left a mark, not because it was dramatic, but because it was real. It stripped away the surface of daily life and reminded me of the depth that exists beneath every face. We are all stories in motion, and sometimes all it takes is one open heart to bring those stories to light. Days passed, but the memory didn't fade. It became something I returned to when I felt disconnected or numb. I began to realize how many people live behind invisible walls built from fear, exhaustion, disappointment, and yet within those walls they continue to hope, to fight, to love. That man was not extraordinary by society's standards. He was not famous or wealthy or powerful, but in his honesty, he revealed a kind of heroism we rarely acknowledge, the strength to keep going despite the weight of it all. I thought of his guitar, stored away somewhere, perhaps untouched for years. I hoped that one day he would play again, not for a crowd, but for himself. And I hoped that his son would heal, that laughter would return to their home like music after a long silence. I began thinking about all the times I'd spoken without really saying anything, all the moments I had filled with noise just to avoid silence. That taxi ride showed me how silence, when shared with empathy, is anything but empty. It becomes a sanctuary, a space where someone else's truth can land softly without resistance. I didn't say a word to him while he talked, and yet I was more present than I had been in most of my conversations. He didn't need my words. He needed my attention, and I gave it without even realizing it. That's the beauty of these rare encounters. They break the rhythm of everyday life and leave behind quiet revelations we didn't know we needed. Sometimes I wondered what compelled him to open up. Was it the fatigue in his bones, the months of holding everything in? Or maybe he saw something in me that made him feel safe, even if just for a short while. We were two strangers traveling through a city of millions, yet in that car, it felt like we had stepped outside of time. He didn't ask where I was going. He didn't care what I did for a living. He only cared that I was listening. It reminded me how often we define ourselves by titles, achievements, and possessions, and how none of that mattered in that moment. What mattered was the truth, raw and unfiltered, being shared by someone brave enough to speak and someone willing to listen. His vulnerability lingered with me like a quiet melody, soft but impossible to ignore. I started noticing how rarely we allow ourselves to be vulnerable, even with those we love. We protect ourselves behind humor, sarcasm, busyness. We hide the ache, the fear, the disappointment, hoping that maybe if we bury it deep enough, it will disappear. But it never does. It waits. And sometimes, all it takes is a kind stranger to unlock it. That's what I had unknowingly offered him. Not a solution, but a doorway. And he stepped through it with the quiet courage of a man who had held in too much for too long. There's a certain sacredness in being trusted with someone's pain. It's not something to take lightly. When someone opens up, they hand you a part of themselves that they usually keep hidden. They trust you not to judge, not to rush, not to fix, just to hold it with gentleness. I didn't earn that man's story. I didn't do anything special to deserve it, but he gave it to me anyway. And in doing so, he reminded me of the deep. Human need to be known, even if only for a few minutes, even if only by a stranger. We are all carrying something, and sometimes all we want is to be seen beneath the surface. That ride made me think about how we define love. We often associate it with grand gestures, with passion and declarations. But love can also be quiet. It can be listening without interrupting. It can be sitting beside someone in their sadness, not trying to cheer them up, but simply being there. It can be the patience to let someone talk for 30 minutes straight about their fears and dreams and regrets. Love is presence. Love is attention. And on that day, love was a taxi driver telling his story, and a passenger choosing to hear it all the way through. I sometimes wonder if he remembers me, if he tells the story to someone else, about the stranger in the back seat who said nothing, and yet gave him everything he needed in that moment. Maybe he doesn't. Maybe I was just one of many faces that passed through his rearview mirror. But I remember him. I remember his voice. I remember the way his eyes softened when he spoke about his son. I remember the weight of his words, the humanity in them. Some people come into our lives briefly, but leave permanent footprints. He was one of those people. I think the world would be a gentler place if we all made a little more room for each other's stories. If we paused long enough to ask, "How are you, really?" and stayed long enough to hear the answer. We live in a time where everyone is rushing to achieve, to escape, to prove something. But healing doesn't happen in a hurry. Connection doesn't bloom in haste. It takes time, patience, and above all, presence. That driver gave me his truth, and I gave him my silence. And in that exchange, something meaningful happened. Something I still carry. After that day, I found myself more curious about the people around me. I began to ask more questions, to listen with less urgency. I realized how often I had listened with the intent to respond rather than to understand. That changed. I no longer feared silence in conversations. I welcomed it. Because in silence, we hear the things that are often drowned out. The tremble in a voice, the pause before a confession, the sigh after a truth is spoken. Silence holds space, and in that space, healing can begin. I think back to that cab, the humming of the engine, the blur of the city outside the window. It felt like a moment suspended between the chaos of the world and the quiet of two souls crossing paths. There was no music playing, no phone calls ringing, no distractions, just the road, the story, and the silence that honored it. I hadn't expected anything profound from a simple ride across town. But life has a way of placing us exactly where we need to be, even when we don't realize it. I was meant to be in that taxi at that hour with that man. And I was meant to listen. As the weeks passed, I shared the story with a few close friends. Not because I wanted attention, but because I wanted them to understand what it meant to truly listen. I told them about the driver, about his son, about the weight of dreams deferred. I told them how sometimes the most powerful moments come quietly, without warning, and each time I shared it, I noticed something in their eyes. Recognition, maybe even guilt. We've all missed moments like that. We've all looked away when someone needed us to look closer. But we can change. We can start listening. Really listening. And in doing so, we might just become someone's quiet miracle. That night, I sat by my window watching the city lights flicker like fireflies in the dark. Each one, I imagined, was a life, a person with dreams, struggles, hopes, regrets. Somewhere out there, that driver was finishing another shift, maybe talking to someone else, or maybe driving in silence. I hoped he was okay. I hoped his son had found comfort. I hoped that sharing his story had brought him a little peace. That's the thing about stories. Once they're told, they lose some of their weight. They don't disappear, but they become easier to carry. And maybe, just maybe, the listener carries a part of it for you. I started writing in a journal again, something I hadn't done in years. I wrote about people I met, things I felt, questions I had. I didn't write to be profound. I wrote to remember, to stay open. That cab ride reminded me that the heart grows stronger when it stays soft. We live in a world that hardens us, but if we're lucky, we find moments that remind us who we really are, that we were made for connection, for kindness, for love, not just romantic, but human. The kind that sees and stays. The kind that listens when there's nothing left to say. I often wondered if I should have said something to him before I left the taxi. Something kind, something encouraging. But maybe silence was enough. Maybe not interrupting, not steering his story toward comfort or solutions was the real gift. We're so used to filling space with advice, with answers. But sometimes the most powerful thing we can offer is our full, undivided presence. A quiet yes. A silent, I see you. A soul that doesn't flinch when someone else is in pain. That's what he needed. And that's what I gave. Not because I planned it, but because I allowed it. Sometimes I go for walks without a destination, just to observe life happening around me, the sound of conversations, the laughter of children, the quiet sorrow on someone's face as they check their phone. I carry his story with me during these walks, like a reminder stitched into my coat. It keeps me grounded. It keeps me human. In a world full of noise and distraction, that one moment of clarity, of raw connection is my anchor. It reminds me that beneath every face is a story worth hearing. if only we slow down enough to listen. There are days when I feel overwhelmed, unsure of my place in the world. And on those days, I think of the taxi, of the way he trusted me with his pain. I remember that I don't need to fix everything. I just need to show up with an open heart. That's what he did for his son. That's what we all do in our own quiet ways. We show up. Even when we're tired. Even when we're unsure. That kind of love, the steady, unspoken kind, is what holds the world together. I believe that now, because I saw it in a stranger's story, shared between two stops on a rainy afternoon. I've also learned to speak less and listen more, to leave room for others to tell their truths, however messy or unfinished they may be. I no longer rush people to the point. I let them wander, because sometimes it's in the wandering that the real story emerges. And when it does, I try to be the kind of listener I needed during my own hard moments. Someone patient, someone present. That cab driver didn't know he was teaching me something that day. But he did. He taught me that love doesn't always wear a smile. Sometimes it sounds like a trembling voice in a rearview mirror. We talk so much about changing the world, but I think the world changes in small, quiet ways. When we hold the door a little longer. When we forgive without being asked. When we listen without needing to respond. That's how healing begins, not with grand gestures, but with soft ones. The kind that go unnoticed by most but change. Everything for the one who receives them. That's what that man gave me, and what I gave him. A soft gesture, a brief sanctuary, a moment of being fully seen and fully heard. That moment mattered, and it still does. I never saw him again. I don't know what happened to his son. I don't know if he ever picked up the guitar again, or if the dreams he shelved ever found their way back. But I do know this. He changed me. Not with a lesson, but with his presence. With his willingness to be real. That's the power we all have. Not to fix each other, but to witness each other. To say, in our own way, I see you. I hear you. You're not alone. Sometimes that's all someone needs to keep going. And sometimes that's all we need to remember who we are. Now, whenever I step into a taxi or a bus or sit next to someone on a bench, I carry a quiet invitation with me, an openness. I don't force conversations. But I stay ready to listen if someone chooses to speak, ready to offer presence instead of answers. It doesn't always happen, but when it does, I lean in with all my heart, because I know now that every story matters, even the unfinished ones, especially the unfinished ones. They are still being written. And sometimes they just need a witness along the way. That driver probably doesn't know how much he gave me that day, but I'll never forget it. In his pain, he offered me purpose. In his story, he gave me perspective. And in his silence, he gave me a truth I'll carry forever. To listen is to love. And love, at its deepest, doesn't always speak. Sometimes it simply stays, quiet, open, and present. like I was that day, like I hope to be, again and again.